I think this is a good point to, transition and think about like what does a good paradigm look like for applying Scripture's formal and material sufficiency, and particularly because of the article you've written in light of this series of for biblical counseling, right? And so you argue that the biblically faithful Christian counselor, ought to be guided, to consider being guided, right, by three principles of prima scriptura, norma scriptura, and suprema scriptura. And so maybe just a couple of questions regarding this. First, maybe just explain what you mean to communicate by these terms before we think through maybe applying it in a couple of ways in counseling ministry.
Yeah. So it's in other words, what does a positive, what does a constructive paradigm look like? And I'm arguing that there are three components to it. Prima, as you said, prima, norma, and suprema. What do we mean by that? Well, first, Scripture is our starting point. Now you say, well, isn't that true for everyone? No. Once you deal, for example, think of evangelical ethicists who deal with pro-life issues. When you read someone like Dan Heimbach and others who've written so well about pro-life issues, they will start with Scripture. They will talk about the Imago Dei. They will talk about, the Psalms that talk about us being fearfully and wonderfully made.
Yeah.
So they start with Scripture. Whereas Roman Catholic ethicists are also pro-life. But what will they start? They will start with natural law. They will start with church tradition. And I'm thankful for natural law. I'm thankful for church tradition, but that's not my starting point. And what one will find when he or she is doing theology and ethics, the difference between an evangelical approach and a Protestant approach versus, say, like a Roman Catholic approach, is Scripture is our starting point. So we start with what Scripture says, teaches, affirms, and so that's prima scriptura. I'm going to start with Scripture. Then, as I am engaging with the subject, I'm going to have the Scripture operate as the guardrails, as the filter through which, the lens through which I engage. And this is not just true in counseling. This is true for those who are dealing with all kinds of questions concerning anthropology, psychology, also faith and science issues, whether I'm dealing with biology and astronomy. So anyone who's involved in any kind of endeavor that has him involved in the world. This is true in the area of politics, the arena of the public square. How do I think about myself in the business world? Scripture is the norm by which I'm going to have to engage with all kinds of non-Christian ways of thinking. How do I deal with that? How do I eat the fish and spit out the bones? And the answer is Scripture guides me. I'm going to be involved and engaged with businessmen, politicians, scientists, ethicists, all kinds of people who are not Christians. And because they are created in the image of God, and because there is common grace, and because there is general revelation, many times much of what they say will be profitable. There will be much that I can glean from this economist who is a free market capitalist, but he's not a Christian. What did he get right?
Yeah.
What can I affirm about this? There are going to be Mormons who are really right about many things that I'll say, okay, I'm tracking with you on this. What do I do with the fact that he's a Mormon rather than an evangelical Christian? Well, there are many things about his teachings or his thinking that I'm going to be able to affirm. Other things I'm not going to be able to affirm.
That's right.
How do I adjudicate that? This is where Scripture operates as my norming. This is norma scriptura. And then at the end of the day, whenever I come up with my model or my construct or my ethical practice, is it right? Well, here's where Scripture is the final authority, and this is suprema scriptura. And how do we apply that? Well, this is where the community comes in. This is where the community of faith, where they say, Ken, you got, of these 7 points that you're arguing, or of these 10 things that you're advocating, you got 8 of them right, but 2 of these are a problem. Well, how are they a problem? Well, let me show you what Scripture has to say here. And here's where the community of faith can call me onto the carpet and say, Scripture is the final judge here. And Scripture says you are not correct. You're correct in so many places, but you're not correct here. And this is
Yeah.
where Scripture is done within the community of faith. And if Caleb, if you and I disagree on something, the community of faith will say, well, here's where you're right or here's where you're wrong, and it is able to adjudicate. And so I would say in the area of counseling and biblical counseling, how do we interact with certain practices, certain methods? And you say, well, where will this show up? Well, I can think of certain areas where, say, someone is ministering to a child of sexual abuse. What are good and proper practices here? Well, it could be that certain practices have been developed by non-Christians. And there are certain ways that we minister to these children who have been victims of terrible abuse. How do I deal with them? Okay, well, here again is where we use these three principles. Whenever we look at what practices they've developed, I'm starting from a Christian perspective. We're employing scriptural guidelines. And when we get done, is what we're advocating, is it faithful to the biblical witness? And so there are all kinds of areas that the biblical counselor is going to find himself or herself dealing with things that you might have to engage with the broader community. And so the broader world. So how do we do that? And I would argue that those three steps, prima, norma, and suprema, that if you do that, I think that's the best model that I know of. Somebody can come up with a fourth step, or they find something that needs to be corrected about that.
Sure.